I set my coffee down on the porch railing and watched the sun come up over the lake. It was the kind of morning that makes a man forget he ever had problems. The water was still. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. And there wasn't a single sound except the birds and the occasional creak of the dock shifting in the current. I had earned this, every splinter of it, 12 years. That's how long my daughter and her husband had made it clear I wasn't wanted in their lives. 12 years of silence, of birthdays that passed without a phone call, of Christmases I spent alone in a 2-room apartment eating reheated soup and telling myself it was fine. 12 years of being erased from a family I had built from nothing, by a man who never worked a hard day in his life, and a daughter who let him do it. And now, on the best morning of the best season of the rest of my life, I could see their car coming down my gravel driveway. I want to tell you how I got here, because none of what happened next makes sense without it. I spent 31 years in industrial supply, not glamorous. I sold pipes, fittings, valves, gaskets, the unglamorous skeleton of every factory and plant and processing facility from Ohio to the Gulf Coast. I was good at it. Not because I was slick or charming, but because I actually understood what my customers needed before they did. I read spec sheets at dinner. I memorized pressure ratings the way other men memorized batting averages. When I was 43, I stopped working for someone else and started my own operation out of a warehouse in Columbus with 6 employees and 1 used forklift that broke down every other Tuesday. My wife passed when my daughter was 16. Cancer, fast and merciless, the kind that doesn't give you time to argue with it. I raised my daughter alone after that. I worked, I came home, I helped with homework. I drove her to every practice and recital and school event, and I told her every single day that her mother would have been proud of her. I was not a perfect father. I know that. I worked too much. I missed things. But I loved her, and I showed up, and I never once made her feel like a burden. She met her husband her junior year of college. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. He was charming in the way that sets off something quiet in the back of your mind. Too smooth, too ready with a compliment, too interested in questions about my business that had nothing to do with getting to know me as a person. But she loved him, and I respected that. The first few years were fine. We had dinners, holidays. When my grandson was born, I drove 4 hours each way just to be in the waiting room. I held that baby in the hospital and I thought, this is enough. Whatever else happens, this is enough. But my son-in-law was always watching, always calculating. He got it in his head. And I know this because my grandson eventually told me, years later, that I was a problem, a competing influence. He didn't like that my daughter still called me on Sundays. He didn't like that when something went wrong, she picked up the phone and called her father instead of leaning on him. So he worked on her, slowly, methodically. The way rot works on wood, you don't see it happening until the board gives way under your foot. First came the distance, fewer visits, shorter calls. Then came the complaints relayed through my daughter. I had said something that made him uncomfortable. I had offered an opinion on something that wasn't my business. I had overstepped in ways I wasn't even told about until after the verdict had been delivered. I tried to apologize for things I didn't understand and fix problems I couldn't see. It didn't matter. By the time my grandson was 5 years old, my son-in-law had convinced my daughter that I was a toxic presence in their family. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it was raining. She told me in a flat voice, like she was reading from a script she had practiced, that they needed space, that it was best for everyone if I stopped reaching out for a while. I asked her what I had done. She said it wasn't about what I had done. It was about what was healthy for their family. I asked if I could see my grandson. She said that wasn't a good idea right now. I sat on that call for another 2 minutes, listening to silence before she said she had to go. That was the last real conversation we had for 12 years. I didn't fall apart. I wanted to. There were nights when the grief of it sat on my chest like a physical weight, and I lay there in the dark of my apartment, wondering what kind of man loses his only child without dying. But I had built something once from nothing, and I knew how to keep moving even when everything in me wanted to stop. I sold the company when I was 61, not to the first buyer, not to the easiest one, but to the right one, a private equity group that had been circling me for 4 years, and I made them wait until the number was right. The number was very right. I bought 42 acres on a lake in western Michigan. I designed the house myself, nothing ridiculous, nothing that screams, "Look at me." Just a 4-bedroom cedar and stone house on a private stretch of water with a covered porch that faces east, so I can watch the sunrise with my coffee every morning. I planted a vegetable garden. I bought a decent fishing boat. I made friends with my neighbors, a retired couple, who brought over pie the week I moved in and checked on me during snowstorms. I was 63 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was at peace. Then my daughter's car came down my driveway. I didn't move from the porch. I watched them park. My son-in-law got out first, heavier than I remembered, wearing a jacket that was trying too hard. My daughter followed. She looked tired. And then the back door opened, and my grandson climbed out, and I felt something move in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. He was 17, taller than I expected. He looked like his grandmother around the eyes. My son-in-law walked up to the porch steps like he owned the property. He smiled with all his teeth and spread his arms wide and said, "Dad, look at this place." I had not given him permission to call me that in 12 years. I said nothing. My daughter hung back slightly. She wouldn't meet my eyes at first. Then she looked up and said, "Hi, Dad." And her voice was smaller than I remembered. I asked them what they wanted. My son-in-law laughed like I'd said something charming. He told me they'd been going through some changes, that things had been difficult. That family was family. And they'd been doing some thinking, and they felt like it was time to reconnect. He said it the way a man reads a fortune cookie, like the words were true because they sounded good. I looked at my daughter. I asked her if she agreed with that. She said yes. She said she was sorry for how things had been left. She said she'd missed me. I told them to come up on the porch and sit down. We talked for an hour. My son-in-law did most of the talking. He told me about the business he had started that hadn't worked out. He told me about some investments that had gone sideways. He told me about the house they had lost and the apartment they were currently in, and how cramped it was and how hard it had been. My daughter nodded along to everything he said. My grandson sat quietly in the corner of the porch and looked at the lake. Then my son-in-law got to the point. He said they had been thinking that, given how much space I had here and how family should be together, it might make sense for them to move in. Just temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. He said he and my daughter could have the guest suite, and my grandson could have his own room. He said it would be good for everyone. He said it would give me a chance to be part of the family again. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at my daughter. I asked her if this was what she wanted. She said she thought it could be good. She said she'd missed me. She said it again. And I noticed. She said it at the exact moment she needed to. Like punctuation. I told them I needed to think about it. I told them they were welcome to stay for dinner. My son-in-law smiled and clapped his hands together and said that sounded great. That night, after dinner, I called my attorney. He was a friend as much as a lawyer, a man I had known for 20 years, and I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me to be very careful. He asked me if I had noticed anything during the conversation that felt off. I told him about a moment at the dinner table where my son-in-law had tried to steer the conversation toward the particulars of my estate, nothing overt, just a question about whether I had updated my will since the sale of the company, framed as concern. My attorney told me to trust my gut. He also told me to start keeping records. I already had. That afternoon, when they had sat on my porch, I had turned on the recording app on my phone before I let them through the gate. Old habit. From 30 years of business, when something feels important, you document it. They came back the next morning. My son-in-law had apparently decided that my thinking about it was close enough to a yes that he brought 2 suitcases. My daughter carried a third. My grandson carried nothing. He stood in the driveway and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between sorry and relieved. I met them at the front door. I had not yet let them in. I told my son-in-law that I would like to speak with my daughter alone for a few minutes before we discussed any of this further. He didn't like that. His smile stayed on, but his eyes shifted. He said, "Of course. Absolutely. That made sense." My daughter and I walked down to the dock. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He really has changed, Dad." I asked her how he had changed. She thought about it. She said he was trying. She said things had been hard for him too. I asked her how long my grandson had been out of school. She looked at me fast. She asked how I knew about that. I told her I didn't. Not for certain. But that my grandson was 17 and had not mentioned school once during the entire previous evening. And that when I had asked him about his interests, he had given me the answers of a boy who had not been in a structured environment for some time. She looked at the water. She said it had been a rough year. She said they had pulled him out temporarily. She said he was going to go back. I asked her if her husband had made that decision. She didn't answer. I told her I loved her. I told her that it never changed and never would. And I told her that I needed her to listen to me very carefully, because what I was about to say, I was only going to say once. I said, "I know why you're here. I know this wasn't your idea. I know you're scared, and I know he's made you believe that this is the only way. And I am not going to turn you away. But I am also not going to let that man walk into my home and do to me what he has spent 12 years doing to you." She started to cry. She said she didn't know what I meant. I said I thought she did. We walked back up to the house. What happened over the next 3 weeks was like watching a machine start up. My son-in-law was methodical. He was patient. He was, on the surface, the picture of a grateful son-in-law making a genuine effort. He helped with firewood. He made conversation at meals. He asked thoughtful questions about the lake and the property and the neighbors. But underneath all of it, there was always the current, always the slow, steady pressure moving in one direction. He started asking about the house, how much property was attached, whether I had considered a trust, whether I had thought about what happened to a place like this after. And he always paused there, delicately, after things changed. He said he'd been reading about estate planning, and he thought I should meet with someone. He had a person in mind. He said he just wanted to make sure I was protected. He introduced me to the person he had in mind on a Saturday, a man who came to the house uninvited, whom my son-in-law had apparently told to just stop by, whom he introduced as a financial advisor. The man was pleasant. He asked a lot of questions. He left a folder on my kitchen table that I read after they went to bed. It was a proposal to restructure my assets into a living trust with a co-trustee arrangement. The co-trustee he was recommending was my son-in-law. I called my attorney that night and read him the proposal. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he needed me to save everything. Every document, every text, every conversation I had recorded. He said what was being proposed was not unusual on its face, but the context was deeply concerning. And if my son-in-law was doing what it looked like he was doing, we needed to be ready. I told my attorney I was already ready. I had been ready since the morning they came down my driveway. The thing that broke it open was my grandson. I had been spending time with him when I could, just the two of us, down at the dock in the mornings while his parents slept in. He was a quiet kid, careful with his words, watchful. He reminded me a little of myself at that age. One morning, about 2 weeks in, he looked at me sideways and said, "Grandpa, do you know why we really came here?" I told him I had some ideas. He looked at the water. He said his father had been talking for months about getting control of my property. He said he had heard his father on the phone with someone, the financial advisor, though my grandson hadn't known. That's what he was talking about. How to do it before I got worse. I asked him what he meant by worse. My grandson said his father had been telling people I was showing signs of cognitive decline, that I was getting confused, that I was not in a position to be making decisions alone. I asked him if he believed that. He looked at me and said no. He said he had told his mother and she hadn't listened. He said he didn't know what to do. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him he had done exactly the right thing. I told him I was going to take care of it, and I needed him to trust me. He said he did. That afternoon, I sat in my study, and I called my attorney, and I told him everything my grandson had told me. My attorney said we needed to move within the week. He said the competency angle was something he had seen before, and it was not something to take lightly if my son-in-law filed any kind of legal motion to establish guardianship or power of attorney on those grounds, even a frivolous one. It could create months of headaches. We needed to get in front of it. My attorney came to the house 2 days later. He brought a colleague who specialized in elder law and asset protection. They arrived while my son-in-law was out running an errand he had told me was about a job opportunity he was pursuing. My daughter was home. I asked her to sit in. She was uncomfortable. She kept looking at the door, but she sat. My attorney laid out what we had, the recordings, the financial proposal, the communications my grandson had described. He explained, calmly and without dramatics, exactly what a co-trustee arrangement of the kind being proposed would mean in practice. He explained what cognitive decline narratives were used for in estate disputes. He was not unkind about it. He spoke to my daughter, the way you speak to someone who is not the villain, but has been standing next to one long enough to have some explaining to do. My daughter's face changed while he was talking. It changed slowly, the way a face does when it's working through something it doesn't want to accept. By the time my attorney finished, she had her hands folded in her lap and she was staring at the table. She said, quietly, that she hadn't known about the competency angle. My attorney said he believed her. She said she had known about the co-trustee idea. She said her husband had told her it was to protect me. She said she had wanted to believe that. I told her I knew. She started to cry. Not the performative kind. Not the kind I had seen in the driveway when she needed something from me. This was the other kind. The kind that comes from the place where you have been lying to yourself for a long time, and the lie has finally run out of room. I moved around the table, and I sat next to her, and I let her cry. My attorney and his colleague found somewhere else to be for a few minutes. When my son-in-law came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room. My attorney was still there. My daughter was there. My grandson was there. The financial advisor's folder was on the coffee table. My son-in-law looked at the folder. He looked at my attorney. I told him to sit down. He sat. He kept the smile going for a few more seconds. The way a light stays on briefly after you flip the switch, and then it went out. I told him that I was aware of the conversations he had been having about my mental fitness. I told him I had documentation of every meeting he had arranged and every proposal that had been made in my home without my knowledge or consent. I told him that my attorney had been in contact with the state bar regarding the individual he had introduced as a financial advisor, who it turned out had had his license suspended in 2 states for predatory practices targeting elderly clients. My son-in-law said that was not something he had known about. I told him I didn't need him to admit to anything. I told him what was going to happen next. I told him he had until the following morning to remove his belongings from my home. I told him that my daughter and my grandson were welcome to stay as long as they needed. I told him that whether my daughter chose to leave with him or remain was her decision, and I would support whatever she decided. He looked at my daughter. He said her name. He said it again. He said they needed to talk. My daughter looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. She said she was staying. He left that night. Not the next morning, that night, 2 hours after the conversation. He loaded his bags into his car in the dark, and he left without saying a word to anyone, except one last attempt, at the door, to speak to my daughter alone, which she declined. My attorney handled the legal details over the following weeks. The financial advisor situation became something for the authorities to look into. And I was not the only elderly man in Western Michigan who had received his folder. My son-in-law, to my knowledge, has not attempted any kind of legal action, possibly because my attorney made it clear before he left that we had enough documentation to make that a very uncomfortable experience for him. My daughter stayed. She got a job in town about 3 weeks after her husband left. A real one. The kind she had quietly given up years ago when he told her it wasn't necessary. She started running again in the mornings. She started calling her old friends. I watched her remember who she was before. And I did not say anything about it. Because some things don't need commentary. My grandson enrolled in the local high school in the fall. He was behind in some things and ahead in others, and he worked without complaint to close the gaps. His teachers told me he was one of the hardest working students they had. He started getting up before his mother in the mornings to come down to the dock with me before school. We'd sit there with coffee, his was mostly milk, and watch the water go from dark to light. And most mornings we didn't say much, and that was exactly enough. One morning, about 2 months after everything had settled, he asked me how I had known from the beginning what his father was planning. I told him I had 31 years of reading people across a negotiating table. I told him that the way his father had walked up my porch steps that first morning like a man who already owned the place was something I had seen before, and it never meant anything good. I told him that instinct isn't magic. It's just experience that's learned to move fast. He thought about that for a while. Then he asked me if I was angry at his mother. I told him no. I told him that people who love someone who is slowly, deliberately rewriting their reality don't always see it happening until someone from outside holds up a mirror. I told him his mother was brave. I told him it takes more courage to stay and face what you've been part of than to pretend it never happened. He asked me if I thought his father would come back. I said I didn't know. I said that wasn't something I could control, and I had stopped spending energy on things I couldn't control a long time ago. I said what I could control was what happened on this 42 acres of western Michigan, and what happened here was going to be decent and honest and worth the effort. He nodded at that like it was something he intended to keep. Last spring, he asked me to teach him how the business had worked. Not because he was planning to go into it, he wanted to study architecture, but because he wanted to understand how I had built something from nothing. We spent a Sunday going through old files, old contracts, the early years when the margins were so thin that a single lost account could have ended it. I showed him the notebook I had kept in the first year. Every call logged by hand, every prospect, every follow-up. He turned the pages carefully, like he was handling something that mattered. He said, "You never gave up." I told him giving up had occurred to me regularly. I told him the difference between giving up and not giving up is smaller than people think. Most days, it's just deciding, one more time, to make the next phone call, take the next meeting, get up one more morning, and try again. I told him the secret to a long effort is that you don't think about the whole distance. You just think about today. He closed the notebook and looked at the lake and said, "Okay." That was all. Just okay. But he said it, the way you say something you mean to remember. My daughter knocked on the door of my study one evening not long after and asked if she could come in. She sat across from me and was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wanted to say something she'd been trying to say for a long time. She said she was sorry, not the kind of sorry that asks for something in return, not the kind that comes with an explanation attached, just sorry. She said she had let someone take her away from the people who loved her, and she knew she couldn't get those years back, and she wasn't asking me to pretend they hadn't happened. I told her they had happened. I told her the years were gone, and I wasn't going to insult her by saying otherwise. I told her that I had grieved her while she was still alive, which is one of the harder kinds of grief. And I wasn't going to pretend that hadn't left a mark. But I also told her that I knew her, and I knew who she was underneath everything that had been done to her, and that person was worth knowing. I told her I was glad she stayed. She nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else and then changed her mind. She got up and came around the desk and hugged me. And I hugged her back. And we stood there for a while without needing it to be anything more than what it was. The lake is still the same in the mornings. The water, the birds, the creak of the dock. I still take my coffee on the porch at sunrise, same as I did before any of this started. But now, there is usually someone else up. Some mornings it's my daughter, running back up the path from the water in her sneakers, flushed and awake. Some mornings it's my grandson, already at the end of the dock with his sketchbook, drawing the way the light changes on the opposite bank. I built something from nothing once. I know how it works. You start with what you have, and you protect what matters, and you make the next right decision, and then the next one, and over time the thing you're building becomes real in a way you couldn't have imagined at the beginning. I'm 64 years old. I have my daughter back. I have a grandson who comes down to the dock in the mornings and argues with me about architecture. I have a house I designed myself on a lake in western Michigan and a porch that faces east. I have enough. More than enough. And not one square inch of it belongs to a man who thought he could take it from me while I wasn't looking. I was always looking.